Hi everybody, welcome to Empowering Our Communities. I'm Richard Walker from Civic Revival. I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this event, and I'm going to hand over to two people to introduce you and welcome you to the event in a moment. We'll just let a few more people come into the event. I was just sort of pondering this morning, thinking that if we'd all been in Bexhill, we would probably have all travelled down to Bexhill yesterday, perhaps met up and had a meal and a couple of pints last night, and had a look around a town that a lot of us wouldn't know, but is very, very interesting. And then this morning we would have gone to the amazing 1930s Delaware Pavilion. And none of that's been possible because of lockdown. But I guess, you know, with Zoom, it's a lot easier, and we've probably got more people than we would have had if we'd gathered everybody in Bexhill. So swings and roundabouts, but we do hope that we'll be in Bexhill before the year is out. Right, now I'm going to get a clue from, I think the number of attendees arriving is stabilizing now, so I think we'll make a start, because we've got a really packed program, which is deliberate. We've packed what would have been half a day's conference into 2 hours flat. So we're going to have to get a move on. So I'm now going to pass over to Peter Stonham from Civic Revival, who's going to welcome us formally to our event. Peter.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everyone. Not much to say because we've got a packed program, as they say, but welcome. It's about a year since Civic Revival was launched. Me and Richard were the main reasons that happened. And our approach has been to try and take a slightly different view of localism in the UK and how all the individual elements of it come together, and how we can share experiences of what is happening locally on the unique experiences of individual places, but together we can perhaps have more punch and more influence if we all work together and share those things and try to evolve some common threads. This event today is a sort of culmination of that, because we have talked a lot through the year to all the people in individual places. Many of you are here today, and we sought to draw up some guiding principles that we think we should have on the table, which come out of that experience, and they'll be launched later on today by Richard. The other function today is to listen to different voices from different places about how they've experienced the need to change things locally and empower the democratic voice of local people. And we've got some excellent speakers on their individual approaches to that in their own places. I'm sure there'll be some common threads and some unique experiences we can all benefit from. One of the things we're very interested in is establishing the basis of local democracy, and not far from Hastings, where our southern base is, the other one being in Bolton in the north. Just along the coast is Bexhill, where there's been a campaign to have a town council, which they've never had, or certainly not in recent years. And that was successfully concluded last year, and they're having their first elections for that council next in May, alongside all the other elections up and down the country. So we're kind of officially coming from Bexhill, although we're coming from cyberspace as well. I'd just like to ask Viv Taylor-G, who was one of the leaders of that campaign to bring democracy to Bexhill, to officially say hi to us and welcome us to her patch. Viv.
Right, well, officially hi. It's a wild and windy day here in Bexhill. I don't think by coming here you'd have had that nice a time struggling with the wind on the front. But it's lovely to see so many people, to know there are so many people who are interested in and following the development of this movement. As Peter says, we have our first elections for a brand new town council, which we've campaigned for a long time, and we're looking forward to it. So I'm also looking forward to hearing from everybody today, and I'll pass you on. Thank you.
A brief and to the point, thank you, Viv. Viv's back later to tell us a bit more about the story that they had to battle their way to get their council. So for our first speaker contributor, Peter McFadden is probably the doyen of this subject, who's written the book and walked the walk about how to take back some democratic control of their local council in Frome in Somerset. Peter's campaigning this year for more people to do the same thing up and down the country. But Peter's story is got all the details anyone would ever want about starting from scratch and really achieving quite a lot. So our first speaker is Peter McFadden.
Great, thank you. And how nice to be here, or weirdly not be here, isn't it? I have been to Bexhill. I came, blimey, must be 18 months ago, to be with Viv and David, and on a blustery day. And I wish I was actually on the beach on a blustery day here. I'm in a very blustery attic in Frome, where I've been, talking to people all over the place from here in this strange way. However, here we are, and as Richard said, possibly more of us than there might have been had we had to come by a fairly long train journey to get to Bexhill. So it was, when I came to Bexhill, it was to meet and talk to a very large group of people in a church hall who were at the final stages of this slightly ludicrous process for Bexhill to get a town council of their own. Because, as Peter says, they hadn't had one since, I think, 1970 something, which Viv will tell us more about later, I'm sure. But it seemed to me at that meeting that there were things which were blindingly obvious. It was completely and utterly clear that the people of this town needed to have a closer link to the people making decisions for them and with them. But yet we had to go through this whole process, and they had to go through a whole campaign and so on. And in my, what's now 10 years of involvement with town councils, that's part of the message, in a sense. There are so many things that seem to me to be completely obvious, but yet we're stuck in the old paradigm. And so for me, the Hansford viral video, which many of you will have seen, no doubt, with a Zoom call of this council in Hansford, which went terribly wrong because people were so aggressive within it. That's sadly not actually that abnormal. I know of a lot of councils which are not dissimilar. And I also know of a lot of councils where there are excellent people who try very hard within a system to make things work. And I suppose my point is that it's largely the system that's the problem. And that over time we've just added and changed and tweaked. But actually it doesn't have to be like that. And so what I've been involved, as again Peter mentioned just then, I've been involved for the last 6 months or so in supporting groups of people from Shottham in rural Durham to Bude to Grimsby to the Isle of Wight to Bexhill to try and see if there are ways of doing this better that can be introduced. And a lot of that's really simple, actually. It's a lot about just making things much more accessible and much less formal, I think. I came across this phrase of, see if I can remember it. Tradition is peer pressure from the dead, which I've come to rather like. Because it's so many of these councils and so much of the way that we operate in local government strikes me as being something that's we've just inherited, and actually it's just not fit for purpose. And so it's particularly exciting to see places like Bexhill and other groups who kind of want to do this differently. And I was in, virtually in Hexham yesterday, talking at the Hexham debates, and the title of that was a democracy, fact or fiction. And I think what I've come to realize or come to feel is that democracy, incidentally, in my view, is a complete and utter fiction. We've never had one. I mean, what the Greeks invented, or what the Greeks gave the word to, demos being people and krasi being rule, rule by the people, has never happened. And actually the Greeks said that if you introduce voting, as soon as you introduce voting, you will get oligarchy. The rich and the powerful will rise to the top. And they were absolutely right. And of course, the Roman rich and powerful who came next noted what the Greeks had said and went, okay, we'll have that. And then essentially, in my rather simplistic view, the Roman Empire led to our empires, and we simply pushed out that system, which has ensured that what we call, or what some people call, democracy is nothing of the kind. It's simply a way of retaining an oligarchy. But as I get older, perhaps I get more cynical and more, I find it more and more harder and harder to see how I personally will ever be able to really influence national government, because national government and the higher levels of our system are so geared into that system. I don't see how I'll ever change it. But what I can be involved in changing is at these community levels. And that's where I've been. It's been such a pleasure to be involved with groups who've taken over to run their councils in really different ways, sometimes putting in place some really radical ideas. So the group in Bude, who have an excellent chance of being elected, largely younger women, which makes a massive change from the 60–70% of old men like me who are councillors at these community levels. One of their main aims is that they will make decisions taking into account the views of future generations, or the needs of future generations, as much as those of the present. Now, I know that's part of the way that the Welsh government decisions are made, but if that's pushed through at this community level as well, I think that sort of idea could be really radical. Because at this level, it's almost like things fly under the radar. Town councils can raise taxes as much as they like. They can do anything that's legal, as long as they've got a well-qualified clerk. The decisions and changes that can really be made at this level, and could be made in Bexhill if they make this radical step into bringing together a group of people who want to do it properly and differently, are massive. And I suppose what I'm saying is that I don't see that changing. I don't see the top end changing. Certainly, all the evidence is that those that are running the country at the top end of our system are doing it for themselves and for their paymasters, and they are mostly masters. Oh, that said the host has muted you. Thought I'm going on too long, but surely, okay, I'm nearly finished anyway. I mean, really, all I wanted to say is that what I find so exciting about this event is that what Civic Revival are doing in their 9 principles for local democratic civic leadership is putting forward exactly the kind of skeleton which I think these new councils need. The kind of thing you need to do this differently. You need to approach this in a different way. And what my experience in Frome was that by having what ineffectively are a set of principles, a group of people can come together and operate in ways that really change things. So if democracy is the art of thinking independently together, which is what I feel it is, a group of individuals coming together, thinking independently, but doing it for their community, then these Civic Revival principles can be really important and really helpful in that process, I think. My experience from Frome is that you really, really can do things, and indeed that no one else is going to do it for you. And I think that's going to be more and more true as we move into a post-COVID recession, and who knows how long the COVID bit will last. But as we move into recovery, this level of council is incredibly important. And I think having these sets of guidance that Civic Revival are working on is really important in that way. So I'm really looking forward to hearing where what's happened and what's about to happen in Bexhill more a bit later, and then some of the other talks and inputs that we'll have. That's basically what I wanted to say. I think anything's possible, but it needs to be done at this community level. And my experience has been that there's some extraordinary and fantastic people out there willing to take that step into really changing this and dragging these councils into the 21st century. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. There's a lot to share where you've come from, and I'm very pleased to hear all those name checks of other places on the same journey. We won't know until beginning of May whether they've broken through, but I'm sure at least some will. We've taken the view most of the time in our Civic Revival activities of looking things locally and trying to join them up in some pattern to help us at a national level. There's a few bodies doing things at a national level looking down to see what's going on around the country. And we thought we'd have at least one speaker today who would take the view from a national perspective of trying to keep an eye on and support this level of activity. Now, Matt Leach is Chief Executive of the local trust, who have the advantage of quite a good resource base on which to sprinkle their favours and learn things. It's very nice to have you with us today, Matt, to tell us a bit about your project and how it relates to the individual activities going on up and down the country.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Peter. I'm going to give you a PowerPoint. I was told to bring a PowerPoint to kind of balance the talking heads against pictures for the audience over what's going to be a really interesting couple of hours. Let me just quickly get my slide deck up. Is that okay? Brilliant. Okay, so really wanted to start off by talking about the community response to COVID. And I think there's been a really dominant narrative that probably kicked off back in March, April last year about how COVID, whilst at times might have been challenging for the state, actually was a triumphant proof of the dynamic potential of people to make a difference, whether it's organising food banks, delivering food parcels to those who were shielding, or indeed in some of our areas running virtual knit and natter sessions for people who'd normally be getting their social interaction from coming to the local community centre. And it became such a big part of our narrative that back in May last year, when New Local surveyed council leaders, 95.5% of them said that they thought community groups were significant to the efforts of their council, which for those in community groups who are used to dealing with councils will have come as a very pleasant surprise, and I guess shows the extent of the shift in perceptions that very, very quickly took hold at that time. But I think there was an untold story happening at the same time, which hasn't picked up quite as much notice, and that's around the places that perhaps didn't have the community institutions there to make a difference. And there were some places, and I'll show you a map of them in a minute, where levels of mutual aid activity were getting on for a third or less of those in terms of density compared to the rest of the country. In fact, less than half the level compared to equally deprived places elsewhere in the country, and where the amount of resource going into those communities was also very low, where there simply wasn't much happening. And it wasn't just that people weren't helping each other, because they weren't organised collectively, they weren't able to bring in resource to help themselves. And if you look at the bottom left-hand graph, you can see the scale of disparity of support money coming into a particular subgroup of communities in the course, the dark blue column, in the course of the first 4 or 5 months of the crisis. And it's noticeable. And those places actually don't just suffer during times of COVID. The places I'm talking about are places which also have a higher level of unemployment than similarly deprived areas elsewhere in the country, and disparity between those areas and equally deprived areas is getting bigger, where there's many fewer jobs per head of the working population, where levels of benefit dependency are much higher, and where levels of sickness and ill health are much worse. In fact, just picking up one particular stat, in the areas I'm going to tell you about, levels of lung cancer are 60 to 70% higher than the national average. And the reason I'm showing you all these charts is because these are places that, in fact, I've drawn lines around them on the map, tend to be communities on the outskirts of industrial towns, whether in the northwest, the northeast, Yorkshire, Hampshire, the West Midlands, predominantly, a little bit on the east coast. we defined them. We started to try to map them out in some research work we did. We started back in 2019, which was updated last year. And what defines these places is that they're not just poor and deprived, but they also lack three essential components alongside that. They have low levels of social infrastructure. So the pubs have closed, the community centres are on their last legs, or have closed as well, where there's low levels of connectedness that perhaps these places, both physically and in terms of human connection, are inward looking and not connected to the outside world. Again, points to their inability to bring resource in, and where there's a lack of active and involved communities, where there aren't the density of community organisations and community activity. And in preparing our report, we mapped every single meeting place, public or private sector in the country, density plotted it. We mapped civic activities, numbers of charities, numbers of community groups, grants going in. We overlaid that on top of deprivation, and we found that if you took the worst 10% of England in terms of deprivation and overlaid it on top of the worst 10% in terms of a lack of civic infrastructure, and this is kind of the Putnam stuff, the scaffolding for bonding and bridging capital, the organisations and places that bring people together in a place, and then the connections to the outside world, the bridging capital stuff, then you get profoundly worse social outcomes than in other places, and other places that are equally deprived. And it seems to me that at a time when we're all about talking about levelling up and making a difference and addressing the needs of those who feel they are left behind, that we need to consider how that can be seen not just as an economic mission about building roundabouts and industrial parks and upgrading Northern Rail, but also a social mission about rebuilding not just the physical and economic infrastructure, but the social infrastructure of places where over the last 20, 30, 40 years that's disappeared. And often these are places where we did pay attention when the big industries moved out. We tried to bring in new jobs. We tried to create new industries when the coal mines went, when the power stations went, when the steel mills closed. But we didn't pay enough attention to the extent to which there was also a gap caused by the disappearance of a shared workplace, by the moving away of trade unions, by the loss of working men's clubs, workers' assemblies rooms, by the loss of both private and community-owned places to come together. So what do you do about it? Well, I guess Local Trust is engaged in a bit of an experiment to see whether you can take radical approaches to rebuilding the civic life of places. And to give you an idea of how radical it is, back in 2010, 2012, 150 communities were picked around the country. And these were often places that were seen to buy lots of scratch cards, but not get much lottery money back. They hadn't had their fair share. And that might often have been because there simply there weren't the organizations there. People weren't organized enough to bring money down to support them. So the radical initiative that we launched was to just go to these places and give them money, to go in and say, actually, as a community, here is £1 million committed to you. You can spend it in any way you want. You just have to self-organize. We won't set any rules. We won't judge. We won't tell you you're wrong. Just go ahead and make your community better using money that we will hold for you effectively as the bank. And across the country, people came together, they self-organized, they consulted with their neighbors. That was one of the few criteria we set for accessing the funds. They set their own plans, and then they started doing stuff, whether it's potting shed, huge community potting sheds in Ipswich, community tidy-ups in Dewsbury, a huge community solar farm in Lawrence Weston down in Bristol, campaigning to reduce rents in Tower Hamlets, building a whole retirement community in Dissington. It's amazing what you can do with £1 million in the northwest of England, where land doesn't cost much, but people have energy and resource to bring to bear. Redefining the identity of a community down in Wirral in the southwest. Community gardens, community football teams, that's in Leicester. A whole new community hub self-designed and project managed by local people in Thurcroft near Doncaster, taking disused homes into community ownership elsewhere in Yorkshire, and a whole range of other stuff, small scale community building activities all over the place. And actually, when COVID came, what was interesting was that in those communities, which often would have been the communities that would have waited for the council to come, because there weren't the people there who knew how to organise, who had the relationships, who had the trust, who had the networks and connections, they would have waited for something to happen. Actually, these are the places where people sprung into action because they knew what to do. Critically, they had access to resources. So the moment lockdown seemed to be happening, they could get together and practically plan to make a difference rather than having to wait and apply for money to come in on terms that external funders might have been setting. So I thought, so I haven't got much time, I just very quickly share some of the learning that we've got to date. And we're 10 years into what's a 15-year program. I guess the first thing is that, yeah.
Can you do 1 or 2 minutes now?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, I'll share this presentation. It works. It's a good way of building civic capacity. People can be trusted with money, and giving people money creates not just projects that can be funded, but critically long-term civic capacity that you don't get when communities are forced to apply for funds on the basis of criteria set by funders. So that's the critical value add. And if you don't, it's great to give money to the poor, but if you don't give them agency and control, actually in the end, you just create another axis of inequality where money goes to people who know how to apply rather than to those who need support. I'll just finish with a couple of slides. People are starting to recognise this. Andy Haldane, Chief Economist, Bank of England, gave a brilliant speech back in September 2019 where he talked about actually how civic and social infrastructure is becoming as important as economic infrastructure. The question is, how do we make that mainstream? If you want to read more about it, this stuff about our experiment, there's an awful lot of stuff on the Local Trust website. If you want to find out more about left behind areas, join the Community Wealth Fund Alliance, which is campaigning for dormant assets to be put to building civic capacity on the basis of giving money to people and trusting them across the country. And if you want to get into the policy debate, there's an amazing all-party group of MPs who are looking at this. In fact, one of the biggest groupings of MPs at the moment in Parliament, and they meet monthly to talk about this stuff. I'll stop now and go to our website and find out more.
Thank you, Matt. That's wonderful. I was just thinking, all of the people we talk to course of the year, obviously there's heaven knows how many communities there are, and must be thousands. If only we could sprinkle £1 million on everywhere. It's not a big sum nationally, is it? But if all of those responses could be replicated, it would be wonderful.
I think there are two answers there. The first is, we could do it if we wanted. A huge amount of money gets pumped into all manner of central government-driven programs. But what they do is create agencies that deliver those programs rather than creating community capacity to make a difference. The second thing is dormant assets. A huge amount of money from that has gone into things like social finance, which is great for giving money to those who can already access streams of revenue to fund it. The next wave of dormant assets, which might be up to £5 billion, is still up for grabs. And we're campaigning to put that into a national endowment, which would target condition-free money to build civic capacity, particularly in areas where you need to build, where there isn't existing civic organisation. And one thing I didn't touch on in my presentation is that where you've left that go, where it's disappeared, it can take 10 or 15 years of work to rebuild civic capacity. So this isn't something you can switch on and off. You need to trust people, but you also need to give them skills, you need to give them time. You can't do that within the framework of government spending. You need to find a way to create a long-term unconditional resource to make that happen. But the money is there if we can persuade government to make that commitment.
Thank you. Yeah, very, very exciting. Probably appropriately, our next speaker, Matthew Brown, who's the leader of Preston Council, has tried to do this kind of thing for the council as a whole in Preston and leverage resources locally. And he's got quite a good profile now as someone trying a new approach on the ground. So we thought it was really appropriate to get Matthew to tell us a bit about how they're doing today. I'm assuming, Matt, you're ready to speak. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to see everyone. I wish I was in Bexhill. Actually, it seems like a lovely place, but obviously we're stuck in the current restrictions, so that avenue of pleasure is not open to me. I do have some slides. So I'll speak about community wealth building on the Preston model and how it can apply in many places. Can people hear and see me okay as well?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. You're just freezing in front of me, Tom. I'm stuck in the 90s a bit with this technology. It's all still a bit new to me, I'm afraid. So if we could go to the first slide, please. Fantastic. So what we're doing is within Preston, we responded about 10 years ago to a number of things that we faced. Firstly, we're not a particularly big council. We're a large district, but we don't have social care or other services. So the city of Preston tried to attract, to regenerate our city centre primarily, quite large global developers. And this was a form of economic development that we tried pursuing from the late 90s onwards. It is very commonplace across the UK that you just primarily try to attract in with investment. You work with large businesses trying to get them into your community. And again, the 2007-8 economic crash, which hit the whole of the UK, led to that scheme being abandoned. It also led to austerity as well. So obviously I'm a Labour politician, and the Labour Party took control in 2011 of the City Council. We had a majority for the first time in some years. So we faced a bit of a triple whammy, really. Firstly, the big business-led initiative that we had fell through. Secondly, we had austerity, and in addition to that as well, there was the after effects of the economic crash with unemployment and other things having to deal with, really. So you kind of it's this idea of democracy that was mentioned earlier. In many ways, it's a bit of an illusion. You actually get some power, but it's very difficult to exercise it in the sense that you don't have much money and powers. And you've got to, in many ways, create your own democracy within your local community and economy. Next slide, please. Okay, so obviously, congratulations on your town council in Bexhill. What you could play a role in is basically being a bit of a thought leader in trying to influence the other much larger councils within your area, big institutions within your area. I know it's as a pavilion. I mean, that can be an anchor institution. But the principle we applied in Preston was looking at what we had already as a starting point. So we had quite a number of big place-based institutions. So these are the further education colleges, hospitals, universities, local authorities, police forces, that are in every community, really, in every region. So we realised that these institutions were spending very little within the Preston economy. So we worked with an organisation called the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, and we approached the head of each institution and said, well, can you spend a lot more locally within our community and local economy? So that has seen a big repatriation of contracts to locally based businesses, often SME businesses. You then get a multiplier effect across the local community. We encourage insourcing as well, because there's been an economic culture for the last probably a number of decades, really, that a lot of services aren't provided democratically and locally by the public sector. They're outsourced often to corporations. We've insourced a couple of things at the council, but crucially, a lot of our anchor institution partners have as well. Also, in every community, there's a public sector pension fund. So local government workers pay into a large pot of money, which across the country is valued at £320 billion. And our public sector pension fund in Lancashire is now worth £9 or £10 billion. And, about 8 years ago, we basically said, as part of our City Deal scheme, can it look to invest directly within our local community? So it's going to invest £100 million in Preston and South Ribble. There's about £40, £50 million invested already, but that's obviously been built a lot of, and is regenerating lots of assets within our city centre, and I'll come on to that later. We're quite inspired by economic alternatives, and my own views is that the current economic model needs to be transformed into something that's more democratic. And the current pandemic has really exposed how inequality has led to certain sections of the community, if you're less well off, disabled, or of a minority community, being disproportionately affected, often down to deprivation. So these economic alternatives can be found in places like Mondragon, which is in the Basque region of Spain, in Emilia-Romagna, in Quebec, with a social economy where they managed to really have what might be called a democratic economy, where there's lots of, especially worker-owned firms. So you've got a number of cooperatives which are actually owned by the workers who live within them. So we're working with it's actually the largest cooperative in the world, actually, Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. Do read about it. It just shows these economic alternatives are successful. And our university and our cooperative development network to establish 10 worker-owned businesses within Preston. And I'll come on to that a little later. We're looking to establish our own bank within the region because the current banking system led to the austerity that we saw, in the sense the financial institutions had to be bailed out. And we support a credit union and also a CDFI. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah, and then as part of working with our institutions, we're hoping that Preston will become a living wage place. So Preston City Council was the first real living wage employer in the north of England in 2012. And we've worked with many of our other big institutions and businesses, so they pay at least £9.50 an hour. We're looking to regenerate our city centre through municipal ownership and enterprise. So we're building a cinema and restaurant development, which will be in the ownership of the city. We're looking at how the council can provide public housing again. Through the planning system, we encourage local supplies and labour on most larger developments within Preston. And then we're refreshing our community wealth building strategy to look at other things like a community land trust, district and community energy, and also very simple things like saying to our councils, our hospital and our university, can you look to recruit people who might have lost their jobs during the pandemic, and also can you look to support companies through procurement who might have struggled during the pandemic. Okay, so now move on to how some of these economic alternatives are actually applied in different places, very similar to what we're doing in Preston. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we talk about banking first, which is really important, money and, who's in charge of money. So on the left, it's a German banking system, which is called the Sparkasse. And in Germany, the vast majority of banks is done through not-for-profits. So it's either done through cooperatives, credit unions, or charities. And in 2007-8, when the economic crash came, what was happening then is that the taxpayer was bailing out the large banks in Germany, whereas the not-for-profits banks and the charitable banks were actually lending to small businesses. And on the right, it's the Bank of North Dakota. That's a publicly owned bank in a state in America. And again, in 2007-8, when there was the Great Recession, unemployment was 40% of the comparable of the average in America, because you actually had a banking system that was democratic and kept and created wealth within the local state. Next slide. So within Preston, we're partnering with Wirral and Liverpool because we want to establish our own regional cooperative bank. And next slide, please. And this is why we need to do this. I mean, what you see on the left is how the current large banks work at the moment. They tend to want to lend to each other or other financial organisations. They don't lend to what could be described as the productive economy. I mean, if you're a small business, you don't want to have £5,000 or £10,000, whether it's Bexhill, Preston, Burnley, Birmingham, or wherever. It's often very difficult to get a loan from the banks. So on the right, the slide on the right shows that in the northwest, we're seeing, lending to SMEs significantly fall, and that's after the taxpayer bailed out the banks about 10 years ago. And in addition to that, we're still seeing banks withdrawing from our high street. So we're saying we want to establish an alternative bank, a regional cooperative bank, which we're hoping to launch in about 18 months. It's been registered with the Financial Conduct Authority, so we're quite excited about that. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is another example of local public pension fund investment. So that is in Alabama. It's an American example. Just by putting 10% of public sector pension funds around that much into your regional economy. That is what they actually create in terms of wealth for the community. So you see 28 billion in GDP for the state, 14.3 billion of earnings, and nearly 300,000 jobs over a 22-year period. And the example there in Alabama, it's built a number of hotels, golf courses, and other things. It's acquired media companies, and crucially, that's the deferred earnings of public sector workers being used to invest locally. Often these public sector pension funds are often invested mainly in the stock market in the UK, but often in quite dodgy things like fossil fuels, tobacco, alcohol, and other things. And it's our argument that a proportion of these can be shifted to more sustainable investments within the local and regional economy. Next slide, please. Yeah, and that's how it's applied in Preston. On the left would have been a disused part of our community a few years ago in Friargate, one of our main streets. The slide doesn't appear to have populated very well, but that is the pension fund owned building on the right. Next slide, please. And again, this is currently being refurbished. It's an old hotel in Preston. It was transferred to local governments. Due to austerity, local government haven't managed to be able to keep it going. So the public sector pension fund is currently in the process of renovating it to what will be restored to its former glory, really. This is a very old hotel in Preston, actually. I think royalty stock there. It used to be owned by British Rail, and again, due to austerity, it's quite run down, and the public sector pension fund is actually regenerating it in Preston. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is again trying to put more democracy in our economy. We could just stop there, please. Yeah, can you just go back a little, please? You've just gone a bit too far. Okay, that'll do. Yeah, thanks. So that is going to be it's going to be a cinema that we're actually going to, it's going to be a cinema we're going to develop. As I said, the big developer approach that we tried to use for so many decades, we're actually building that ourselves. So it's going to be in city ownership in Preston. So crucially, because we're going to own it, the profits will go back to the council if it does make a profit and be spent on services. But crucially, during the construction and development phase, we have a say over local labour standards, over encouraging local companies, local employment of people post-pandemic, also the environmental standards of the development once it's built. So again, you're getting that democracy within your local economy and community. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I mentioned before about working with our big institutions and trying to make sure a lot more was spent within our local economy. So again, there's an obsession often through the current culture of economic development that you just try to attract inward investment, try to get companies, corporations often to locate to the community. But again, this just shows the amount of wealth that's in Preston's institutions anyway, because we've got 2 councils headquartered here, university, colleges, hospital, and they were spending just 5% in the Preston economy. But by changing the culture and working with the procurement teams, that had increased to 18% in 2017, and across Lancashire, the county, that had doubled. So for Preston, that was an extra 75 million our big institutions were spending with Preston-based companies. And these are often family-owned businesses, often in construction. And if you go to a medium-sized construction firm, there's often a family of about 120 subcontractors, often self-employed, that ripples through your local economy when they actually win contracts. And crucially, there's a lot more jobs created doing it that way, because there's less wealth extraction to shareholders and other things if the family-owned companies and small businesses it's supporting. Next slide. Yeah, this was one of our venues that we've managed to insource. So that was the day we brought it back under local authority control. So obviously the staff are receiving a real living wage. They have access to trade unions and all the benefits that come from being council employees. Next slide, please.
Matt?
Yeah.
Have you got 2 or 3 minutes so you can finish in, please?
Yeah, I'll be done in 2 or 3 minutes. Don't worry, we're coming to the end.
Which is great.
Yeah, this is our new cabinet member. It's Councillor Freddie Bailey. So what we're doing is we're actually obviously got a commitment to community wealth building, so Freddie's taken on that role to actually promote these ideas going forward. Next slide. This is one of our worker cooperatives in Preston, the Larder. It's in a council building, so it's a food cooperative. It obviously sources from local suppliers and other things. And obviously, you want that to expand and hope we can win contracts from the local public sector, hospitals, prisons, universities, and create more jobs. Next slide. And again, this is the PDF. This is our second worker cooperative going forward. And again, this is university graduates and a lecturer that have formed a cooperative business. So they're staying in our community, not going away from Preston to Manchester or Liverpool or wherever. And again, that's supplying to the local universities, one of our big institutions. Next slide. And then we've relaunched our community wealth building strategy. So we're looking at how we can recover from COVID through trying to tackle the climate emergency. So that's encouraging district heating, community energy. The bank will be constituted to support the green economy. We want the pension fund to invest a lot more in our community, in the clean energy sector, and then look at cooperatives and how to become net zero carbon by 2030. Next slide. Yeah, and a lot of these policies helped us be voted the most improved city in 2018, which we're very proud of. Next slide, please. And again, those are the improvements. And in terms of jobs, because especially around the procurement side of things and the local investment, there was lots of more jobs in the local economy. And obviously, we did do very well in 2018 for economic well-being compared to other places in terms of improvement. And we feel these policies have contributed to that. So if we go to the final two slides, I'll just show how this movement is actually growing both in the UK and abroad. So next slide, please. Oh dear, that's not come across very well. But what I was going to say is that there's a community wealth building movement that's actually in the UK. You go to Newham, Salford, the Welsh Assembly, North Ayrshire, north of Tyne. They're all looking at these policies around how to establish a more democratic economy. So it's quite exciting in the fact that these conversations that weren't taking place 10 or 15 years ago are now taking place about, crucially, who owns the local economy? Can we look at supporting different forms of ownership which are more grounded in communities and that can tackle wealth extraction? Next slide. Yeah, the technology is at the best, isn't it? But so again, this is it's an international movement in many ways. That if you go to many American cities like New York City or Chicago, they're adopting community wealth building strategies. So in New York, for example, in the Bronx, they're supporting worker-owned businesses in deprived communities there. If you go to San Francisco, they're talking about a public bank, so they're actually protected from the recklessness of Wall Street. If you go to Sydney, they've adopted a community wealth building strategy around procurement, so where they buy has social, economic and environmental benefits. And then even in Africa as well, they're looking at community wealth building in Tanzania because they have problems as well with inequality, as you can imagine, and they're looking at how they can become more resilient to have more local and democratic ownership in their communities through cooperatives and community banking there. So that's it. I've probably run on for quite a bit, and I know it's big picture stuff, but I think what I'm trying to say with this presentation is that there's a kind of like, we're in a moment really where many areas and communities are responding to the inequality and the disinvestment that we've seen in the last few decades. And I think with COVID, this is even more acute. And, this architecture of a democratic economy, obviously we started a conversation in press and that's spread elsewhere, but it's in many places now. And it's just down to the fact that, there's so much wealth in the hands of so few people. We've got to look at how we can create alternatives to that and do that lawfully. And I think through conversations around what you can do within your local area, through, intellectual leadership from a town council in Bexhill potentially, you can really move forward with these ideas and try to tackle the inequality we've seen and that's been exposed so badly during the pandemic. So I bet I've overrun this, Peter, but again, thanks for the invite, and I'm happy to take any questions on the panel later if you want me on it. Cheers.
Thank you so much. Congratulations on what you've achieved. I mean, it's a great example of a local beginning spreading outwards rather than the other way around, which is really what we're all about. So I mean, I hope more people can copy and learn from you, and it could spread far and wide. Thank you. You'll be back on the panel later, so there may be more comments and questions. Next up is Ruth Hubbard. Now, Ruth is one of the movers and shakers in a citizens' campaign to change the way the local council in Sheffield works. There was a little bit of national publicity about what was going on in Sheffield the last couple of years about the trees in the street, but I'm sure there are other reasons why Ruth believes that the way the council was run was not right, and it wasn't actually delivering a democratic result for the citizens of Sheffield. You've got a referendum coming up next month, or the month after next, actually, for the last few days, to try and change that, Ruth. So we're delighted to have you here today to tell us about how you approached changing the way the council was run in your city.
Thank you very much, Peter. Do we have my slides, Tom?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, can you leave it on the second one for a bit, please, Tom? So thank you, everybody. I'm Ruth Hubbard from a citizen and community network in Sheffield called It's Our City. We organise independently of political parties, and that's been very important to us here in Sheffield. And I'll probably say a little bit about why. And we are making common cause across our differences, and we are working on issues of shared concern. I'm here to tell you briefly then about what the action we're taking here in Sheffield, a city of 500,000 people with great diversity, great inequality, a council strapped for cash and experiencing year-on-year cuts and constraints on its spending power. And I'm going to tell you about the action that we are taking to try and reset our local democracy, and many of us say to restore our local democracy. Before I just get into that, I want to say congratulations to those of you from Bexhill. And I want to say, believe me, we know in Sheffield just how hard fought that fight is likely to have been. And well done and congratulations. Well, campaigns for change don't come out of nowhere. And in Sheffield, we have, and we still have, a very hard to reach council. Later on, Sheffield residents around the streets of our city talked about our council as authoritarian, as totalitarian, as punitive. They talked about a chronic disconnection between citizens, communities, and our council. And they said councils were interested only in controlling, managing, and manipulating communities, particularly in relation to party political interests, a divide and rule, tribal political culture, rather than simply listening, responding, and involving citizens in a shared endeavour as we look after and steward our city. Perhaps the peak came during the tree campaign, which Peter mentioned. Local people tried to engage in talking to our council and objecting to and raising concerns about the plans under a PFI £2.2 billion contract signed in 2012 to fell 17,500 of our magnificent, valuable and environmentally important street trees that line the streets of large areas of Sheffield, and why this was necessary under its highways contract. And when this didn't work, and it became clear that the felling of this number of trees was likely entirely unnecessary, people mobilised in large numbers to stop the felling. ordinary people, often retired people, mums and their children. And when I moved to Sheffield in 2016, it was immediately clear that something was going very, very wrong. The period from late 2016 started with a 4 a.m. dawn raid in one street, residents knocked up by police, unnotified, told to move their cars, arrests made, Nick Clegg turning down to support his constituents, believing the councils had, I think, lost their minds. Several large street trees felled. This continued through 2017 with a council injunction, the introduction of large numbers of police and security guards at fellings, many campaigners getting arrested and taken to court, the council pursuing imprisonment of local residents and including a local opposition councillor, and of course legal actions costing into the hundreds of thousands of public money. And through this period, a growing number of people realised that this wasn't really about street trees. I mean, it was about street trees, but the refusal to engage with communities was not confined to street trees. The refusal to engage was symptomatic of something much deeper. But actually, Professor Matt Flinders, a political scientist, has called a deeply defensive political culture and top-down, highly centralised decision-making. This was not actually about a Labour council. This was about a political culture. And Labour councils certainly don't have the monopoly on top-down, executive, strong leadership, disavowing all others. And this is the point at which some councils have gone down the independence road. They've said, well, we'll just get rid of them and we'll elect some independents. And although that's hard, but it's possible. This is a big northern post-industrial city. We are in the grip, in the stranglehold of party politics. The last independent on our council sat on the council in 1982. None of us want to be local councillors. We're interested in having a council that works for us and that is democratic. We have a local political history deeply rooted in Labour politics and the factionalism, the history of the Communist Party. And many of us in Sheffield had great sympathy with our council, experiencing cuts. Many people were Labour supporters and many agonised at local elections about who could they vote for. Can you go on to the next slide? This is Sheffield. We have 28 wards. We have 84 councillors. And the way our council's governance works, that is in the council constitution, is it operates strong leadership. And strong leadership is in the DNA of our council constitution. I heard someone else describe it the other day as it's the hard wiring of the council. Doesn't matter who's in power. This is how your council works. We have 28 wards in Sheffield and 84 councillors elected by local communities across our city. 10 out of those 84 councillors hold almost all the power. They make almost all the decisions in our city. And the 74 councillors left over play no formal decision-making role. They have no power or rights to be decision makers. Effectively, we are unrepresented. Many, many thousands of people across Sheffield are unrepresented in decision making. And we began to realise that this was about a fight for democratic representation. And a different way of looking at this is if you go on to the next slide. This is Sheffield Labour Council's electoral mandate. And you will see the little red box on the left, 9.7% of the electorate in Sheffield vote for Labour here, and yet they hold all the decision-making powers. And of course, what's striking about this graph is the number of non-voters. And any council could do this exercise, and they would have a large column on the right. What do you do when you have this situation? This means that fewer than 1 in 10 voted for the ruling group, and yet they hold almost all the decision-making power. So what do you do when you have a hard-to-reach council? When you're not going to go down the independence route? We have had independents who stand. They'll get a couple of hundred votes, but basically we are in the stranglehold of party politics. No one's anti-Labour, but we want a council that represents us and allows councillors, all councillors, to do the job that people elect them to do, and that is to represent us in decision making. Now, councils have a choice about where they work. This is strong leadership. This is a leader and cabinet model. And what we found in Sheffield is that more and more power has been sucked to the top of our council. The top of our council, the political, they can delegate down powers to people, but those can always be pulled back. And what we have increasingly found in Sheffield is the remote, distant, top-down council. And what did we do? We turned to each other as friends and as neighbours and as communities, and we started to have conversations with each other about what we were going to do. We had to change the way our council worked. More than 90% of us were unrepresented. It's a basic democratic right of representation. And this was also about participation, because right of representation, right to participation, this is how our local democracies work, how our democratic ecosystems, if you like, work. Democracy is not a vote every 4 years. Democracy is an idea and an aspiration which inspires movements around the world. And often they're based on notions of representation and participation. And here in Sheffield, we have no community forums, no local area committees, no local level in a city of 500,000 in which we could participate. The thing we were allowed to do was to ask public questions, and people were regularly humiliated and bullied in the public gallery when they asked challenging questions, because if you were not with us, we were the enemy. And so we started organising around our shared concern, and we turned to each other and said, what do we care about? We care about each other, and we're going to work out together what it is we need from our council. And top of the list was to say, we cannot have a council working in this way. And we discovered a little known provision in the Localism Act, and we exercised our community rights under the Localism Act to try and force our council to hold a referendum on the way our council works. And we had to collect a petition of 5% of the local electorate, and that would be legally binding on our council. And our council would, at that point, lose the right to decide the way it worked. And that's what we did. And we went out across Sheffield, in the streets, in the parks, around shops, at events, to community groups, and we had 20,000 conversations about local governance. And it's probably the biggest exercise anywhere ever of its kind. And people, I mean, who knows that their council has a constitution? People were appalled. They thought they were electing their councillor to represent them in shaping decisions, in working forward, and yet they were not. And Sheffield operates very extreme forms of strong leadership, and with all locked out. And the alternative to strong leadership is a modern committee system. And since councils were allowed to introduce modern committee systems, 30 plus have changed that. And in councils with modern committee systems, every councillor has a right to participate in decision making. We collected over 26,000 signatures, the largest change of governance position anywhere ever in the country. It was due to the referendum, was due to happen last year, and of course, because of COVID, it did not happen. We have built massive community bonds across our city. There have been huge attempts to divide us, to say we are anti-Labour, we're a Lib Dem Green alliance, it's all rubbish. We have been told that we lie, and so on and so forth. But it is through the action of Sheffield communities and citizens working together that we have now achieved our referendum. And when we handed in our petition, out of the blue, I mean, I think I knew 24 hours in advance, 6 Labour councillors resigned from their cabinet posts, including the deputy leader of the council, because they actually supported, it turned out, what petitioners were trying to do. But up until that point, could not speak out within a tribal, strongly whipped environment. And so we have our referendum on the 6th of May. And what I want to say about this is very briefly, one, we've been contacted by at least 20, that's us handing in the petition, 2019. And that photo is us on the town hall steps taking the petition in.
Ruth?
Or, yeah?
Can you bring it to an end, do you think, please?
I'm going to bring it to an end.
Yeah.
We've been contacted by at least 20 groups around the country wanting to do similar, experiencing the same problems in their council. I want to say that when councils are tied up with budgets, with pressures, with service delivery issues, our councils and our government are not really that interested in democracy, a lot of them. That is why it is so important that citizens and communities are. I want to talk about I want to mention then the importance of thinking hard about what democracy means and what the exercise of power means. And democracy is an idea which inspires movements around the world. And it's really worth looking beyond the bounds of one's own local environment to see what is going on in this country and beyond. And I want to talk about the dangers of strong leadership and how that might be fine when you have a progressive leader, but as soon as you don't, it leads to problems. And so I want to say, love your checks and balances in your constitutions. And finally, I would like to see councils not treat their constitutions as merely technical documents. They are full of meaning. I would like every council constitution to begin with the words, this is the constitution of the people of wherever it is, Sheffield, Bexhill, Rother, and for us to reclaim our democracy. Thank you.
Very much. Very inspiring, Ruth. Fingers crossed for May the 6th. And
oh, Peter, I want to add one more thing.
Yeah.
You know, party politics, we are caught in a trap. And I want to say that people and communities and citizens are always bigger. And it is amazing what people can achieve when they work together. But change against those systems is also very hard.
yeah,
Sorry.
very hard. And at another level, Viv will now tell us how hard it was to get a simple thing like a town council, which everybody else in Rother has except Bexhill, to get into creation, which they've done, and the elections are following. So it's another reason next month, May, we're going to have a big eye on what happens. Viv, can you tell us about the struggle of democracy for Bexhill?
Yes, as you say, it's a simple thing, really, creating a town council. Back in 1902, Bexhill had its own borough council, and it got its royal assent from Edward VII. And then it was abolished in 1974 and taken into this big area called Rother, 197 square miles, mostly rural. And we were the only part of Rother that didn't have a parish council or a town council. Clearly unfair. And in 2011 onwards, probably before, that there was a growing campaign of enthusiasts who really felt this should be addressed. And they managed to raise a petition of 4,000 people, which gave rise, of course, legally to a community governance review. So they had the CGR, and meanwhile, we were campaigning with the CGR, and we formed this group called Democracy for Bexhill. And a lot of patterns were suggested of how it could be better, but a town council seemed the most obvious thing. And so we went for that. And we campaigned as you do, with meetings and posters and songs and demonstrations and leaflets and so on. And we were helped by the fact that Rother wasn't a very popular council at that time. And there were a lot of things that we felt could be better for local people. So we had the CGR. It was a response, of course. People were asked to respond to this consultation. Consultations in Rother normally get a couple of hundred people. We had 9,000 people responded, 93.5% of them supporting the idea of a town council. So with this wonderful victory, the council meets, Rother meets to decide what to do, and they decide, no, we don't think we'll give you a town council. There is no appeal system in the CGR thing. They had the last word. So everybody was pretty astonished and dismayed by this. And so the members of Democracy for Bexhill decided to find people who would stand against the Rother Council in the next election of 2019, almost as a gesture. We didn't expect it to have much in the way of impact. But on the night of the count, it was clear that it was a complete revolution in a way. So all of the people who stood won their places, and 17 of the 18 councillors in Bexhill lost and were replaced by supporters of a town council, which they'd made a promise in their manifestos, most of us, that we would support the creation of a town council. So that meant that the Conservatives, for it was them who were in charge then, lost control of Rother. And in place, we now have this alliance, which has changed the climate considerably. But we still didn't have a town council. Then we were told that we had to have another CGR, and the Rother approved of the idea, but they had to go through the whole motions again and do it properly. And people responded. Fewer people responded, I think, because they were fed up with being asked about this question. It's been going for years. But of course it was a big majority, and so it was created, and it will in fact take place on May the 6th. The trouble with the CGR is that it's just a consultation. So of course there are many people who felt that they hadn't had a referendum, they hadn't had a proper vote on it. And so the opposition quite rightly highlighted the injustice of it, really, that the majority was just a majority of people who'd responded. And I think that's one of the problems with the system as it is. Not only do you have to campaign for years, not only does a district council have the right to refuse to listen to its own consultation, but you are stuck with a situation that nobody really accepts as being democratic by any manner of means. So we are aware of that. However, I've seen these wonderful, inspiring pieces from across the country, and I really feel we're on the very tip of a huge lake of opportunity, but we're just a little place. And the people who have formed a group, there are many independents now standing for the election. There are no Tories and Labour are not standing as such. Lib Dems and Green are standing, but most people are standing as independents. And a group of us have formed a particular group called Bexhill Together, which is inspired by this movement. And it remains to see exactly what's going to happen. Of course, we don't know. But the main thing, and this is why we called ourselves Bexhill Together, is to give people the opportunity to bring people together, whatever their views actually are. We have to work together, and even if we don't sweep the floor, then we hope that we will have some input into making that voice clearer and to questioning the way things have been done. With a new council, the temptation will be to say, well, what do we do now, and what does everybody else do? We don't want to do that, and we hope that the new people, whoever they are, will look at that situation and take it with both hands and say, right, what really is beginning to work in other parts of the country, which is why we found the whole flat packery inspiration so useful. So that's a short potted history, and we're very grateful for everybody coming and adding to our inspiration. We'll do our best on the day, but of course with COVID, getting the word out there has been really, really difficult. We haven't got any big finances either to help. So who knows what will happen, but it's been a great ride so far, and I'm sure it'll get even more exciting. That's it. I can't hear anything. I seem to have lost sound.
I'm on now, I think. Thank you so much, Viv. Very inspiring. Good luck on the 6th of May. And I think that fits quite well into the way we've structured the morning, because Richard Walker now will speak about the principles that we pulled together based upon listening to what happened in Bexhill, based upon listening to what happened in Sheffield, based upon what has been achieved in Preston, to try and codify some broad statement of what it is that is good and what it is that needs to be improved in order to get the situation right in more and more places. Richard, can you talk us through our 9 principles now, please?
Yes, I will indeed. Right, I'm going to attempt another go at sharing my screen, everybody. So here we go. Right. Unfortunately, I can't see what you can see, but can you see my slides?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So, if this is the first time you've joined Civic Revival, we're actually running less late than we usually are, but we are running late and we're cutting into the time for panel discussion. So I'm going to canter through these slides. So if you've not come across Civic Revival before, we've been going for 12 months now. We launched this slide on our website in July last year. And what we're really trying to do is, it's quite a difficult job of trying to come across with overarching concepts that bind together all the kind of civic action you get at the local level, and try and kind of create some conceptual framework for it all. And we came up with our 5 key civic building blocks, which you can see there. Okay, so these 5 key civic building blocks. So we've spent quite a while last year working those out. What we felt, and we, what Matt Brown from Preston was talking about is the new economic and ownership models, and what Ruth and others have been talking about is genuine democracy and citizen action. And we're trying to come up with a concept that brings all those things together, and we think they all support each other to deliver what we call a civic revival. Next slide, please, Tom. Yeah, so then when we realized that the May 2021 local elections were going to be a really big deal, there's 2 years worth of elections in one, we decided that we'd try and draw together what we'd learned and what we'd found out by talking to people into what we called at one point a manifesto for civic revival, which we would launch in time for the local elections this year. And we wanted to have something that put across our ideas to all candidates from any party for any level of local authority. And we did a series of really interesting discussion forum sessions before Christmas, which covered mapping the territory of civic revival, the proof of concept of self-governance, what we call a human scale. And we also looked into this issue of master planning, which Matt Brown touched on earlier, and some of the problems that's causing in a lot of our towns and places. And they're all written up on the Civic Revival website. But what we then thought the challenge we then had was to bring those together into a single document to say, what is it that local democratically elected representatives need to do to deliver this civic revival? And we came up with, next slide, please. Yeah, so we had the principles. We end up with the concepts of principles for local democratic civic leadership, and what we felt was something that guides how we define what we call the spirit of local democracy. Local democracy is not just about service delivery; it's about the overall custodianship of any place, community and elected representatives together. And we wanted to try and crystallise those elements which we've said when they're followed in a single place, things go well, and when they're not followed, lead to bad outcomes that spoil places and baffle their citizens, or indeed send their citizens to jail in the case of Sheffield. And we shared this with all the people that we've been dealing with, who've been on the journey with us this year. And the feedback was, well, perhaps we shouldn't need to say these things, but we do, and we're glad that Civic Revival's brought them together. So we thank everybody who's engaged with us for that. So next slide, please, Tom. So we ended up with, as I say, the 9 principles for local democratic civic leadership, what we ask of those standing in this year's local elections. Next slide, please, Tom. And the concept of this is that you show it to your candidate, any party, and say, how do you react to these concepts, these principles? And what we're really trying to do, I think, is to just raise the concept of these civic issues. Now, I haven't got time to go through them all, but I will go through them quite quickly. But we want to cover the first one is what we call plain dealing, protecting the planet, protecting places, supporting the local economy, and I'll go through them all, but quite quickly. But if you want to see them in full and read them carefully and respond to them, then please go to Civic Revival website and contact us, and we will keep the debate going via the web. So next slide, please. So I think the first one, which we came up with the name Plain Dealing, the Cleveland Plain Dealer is the newspaper in Cleveland, Ohio, where community wealth building started, which is interesting. But what we're trying to say is that honest communication is at the center of being an elected representative. We need to be open about the problems and trade-offs that face any elected representative. And one of the problems we've got is that we cannot have openness or glasnost or whatever it is the way forward, and not to endorse arrangements that are made behind closed doors that are not available for discussion by those the actual electorate. And we're trying to think of a place that kind of embodies that kind of approach to running a council. And we've gone to Peter McFadden's Frome in Somerset, where the Independents for Frome have opened up everything they do. So they're all council meetings, all council decisions are highly open, and they've kind of invested in welcoming everybody in the community in, and they've had a payback in terms of people engaging responsibly and understanding that it's not easy to run a town. So next slide, please, Tom. The second and third ones we've lumped together: protecting the planet and protecting the place. From a personal perspective, the crisis, COVID has been an emergency, but the crisis and the thing that's going to face us for the rest of the whole century is the climate crisis. And we in what we do in our local areas through local councils at every level, is that we've got to start taking that seriously. We've got to do all the things that we know we need to do to get us down to zero carbon living. And the place that I felt, I hope we've got Lancaster Vision on the call today. They've definitely booked to attend. Lancaster City Council, I think, is a really good example of a place that has tried to put understanding the impacts of what they do on the global environment and the local environment in a very open way. They discuss that at every level. Now, protecting the place is one that's closer to what we're talking about Civic Revival in terms of planning decisions, which most councils have input into or actual responsibility for. We want to protect local character, culture, identity of the area, and it's not just in planning decisions, in everything we do. But what we want to do is foster the pride people have in the place as it is, and don't spoil or destroy what local people like, treasure, and value. And this is, in a way, is a small c conservative value, but it's conservation, a small c conservation. And the place that we felt that we encountered our travels that had really delivered that approach is David Beeman and the Farnham Town Council in Surrey, where the community plan that they've got through does exactly that, and is giving people the town that they want rather than spoiling the town that they love. So next slide, please, Tom. The next three are support the local economy, empower local solutions, and enable local futures. And they're kind of three angles in on the same thing, really. The first one is about community wealth building and using the local public procurement heft of the local anchor institutions to invest in the local community. What we call the Preston model, which Matt Brown explained brilliantly earlier. Empower local solutions is sort of more of the Matt Leach type area, where trusting the community and locally based organisation to take on and run assets of community value, facilities, things that people want in their local area that they can provide themselves if they're given the adequate support to do so. And the embodiment of that approach, which Dina Wild Goose from Colville in Leicestershire is on the panel later. That's precisely what's going on in Colville, and it's precisely what is an approach that can be rolled out anywhere, at any size of town, any scale of urban neighbourhood. The third one, which I think is quite an interesting one, is enable local futures. So we're saying we want to give people a reason to stay in the town where they grew up. So make every effort to make that feasible and viable. So every effort to secure local jobs, homes and livelihoods, and support forms of land ownership, housing, commercial property development, economic activity, which are rooted in local resource and local enterprise. And the embodiment of that kind of concept is a place that a lot of people don't know, but is well worth looking at, which is Watch It on the Bristol Channel in Somerset, where the Unnamed Collective are doing remarkable things to give what is quite a small, surprisingly deprived community in what is actually a holiday coast, but giving them a future. And they're actually building a cooperatively owned factory to produce eco-building materials, which is an extraordinary piece of community enterprise. And anyway, I just thought I'd give them a name check. Right, next slide, please, Tom. The other two, ensure community expression and facilitate informed debate. So the first one relates to publicly accessible shared venues for cultural events, gatherings, whatever people want to do, weddings, parties, the lot, bar mitzvahs, all that kind of thing. And again, this is the kind of thing that the community can provide for itself. And the two examples I wanted to throw up here is the wonderful Victorial Hall in Saltaire in Bradford in West Yorkshire, which was actually built as a community facility when the model village of Saltaire was built in the 1860s, and is still run today by community enterprise. And I also wanted to give a shout out to the Carla Sangam Centre, which is in the old post office in Bradford City Centre, which is where Francis Northrop will know well, who's on the panel later. That is a arts and cultural venue that's open to every part of the Bradford community and plays a big part in bringing together the different ethnic groups and social groups in that city, and is a wonderful example of what's possible through the kind of local civic enterprise that we want to do. The eighth, I need to hurry on through these, but the eighth one is about the local media. We've got a huge problem, which is that we're losing our traditional local newspapers and a kind of accepted independent forum for the debate of local issues, trusted independent information. And so we are very keen to make sure that the internet democratizes access to media and access to putting things out, but it also creates problems in terms of a kind of a definitive independent statement of what's going on. So it's a problem that we need to solve. I don't think the solution is quite there yet, but we wanted to give a shout out to the East Finchley Archer, which Noel Lynch, who's going to be on the panel later, was very much part of founding and keeping going in Finchley in North London. That's a local citizen-led community newspaper that just tells you in a fair and impartial way what's going on in the area, and gives a platform and a public notice board for people to campaign for what they need to do. And that's the kind of thing that is, again, every single community in the country could do this. Some really great examples, but let's see more of the good stuff. Next slide, please. And the final one, which I won't dwell on, is collaborate for common cause. So this is about this cross-party, let's put our party tribalism aside to say, let's do what we need as a place, as a town, to give local people continually communicate with local people to ask what they want, and then work together across party lines to battle for the local place. And I'm conscious of a comment made at one of our previous things by Susanna Rustin from Queen's Park Community Council. Everybody in local government, instead of fighting each other along party lines, should unite to fight the centre and fight for more resources and more powers for local government. And I think that's something that I think that you'll find is very, very popular. So collaborate for common cause. And I've left you with a picture of the beautiful Delaware Pavilion, because it would have been lovely to have been there today. Hopefully we will get there before the summer is out, when the weather's looking a bit like that, to have a look around Bexhill. And that's where we are. So that's the end of me. I'm going to hand back to Peter now.
Thanks, Richard. That was very concise, and I think everybody can now understand why we felt we needed to express in some principles all of that message that we've heard this morning, which is coming through locally but not everywhere, and is not perceived perhaps as it should be on a national level. Now, the final piece of the morning is a discussion. We've got a panel of both people who've spoken already and some new contributors to answer the question, which I'd like to pose, is what's stopping us all? We've seen what can be achieved. Why isn't it being achieved more widely? And what are the barriers that, if we had the voice to raise with national government, we would say, please sort out these blockages to this happening, whatever they are? It seems to me that there are less blockages than perhaps people perceive, because Ruth's demonstrated that using the tools of the Localism Act, you can get change underway. Matthew's demonstrated, without any new powers specially given to Preston, that there's quite a lot of levers you can pull. And my worry is, why aren't more people doing this? Is there something we can all do to make it easier, or to help the resolve and support other people wanting to do the same things? So before we go to a discussion with the panel, there are three contributors who you haven't heard from yet, four actually, who I'd like to just allow to say a few words about their own situation. The first of them is Frances Northrop. You heard Frances' name checked by Richard as her connections with Bradford. She works for the New Economics Foundation and is now in Totnes in Devon, I believe. Frances, can you just give us a quick take on your own position in all this?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everybody. That was really, really good to listen to. So very briefly, in my own sort of voluntary time, I'm a developer of a community-led development company, director here in Totnes, that's looking to bring forward an dairy plant for for mixed use development. So I really understand the barriers to kind of doing local economic development in a really practical way. But in my professional life, I advise people across the country, including lots of lovely local trust areas, lots of big locals, about how to build their power. And I think there are 4 things, and one Ruth spoke incredibly eloquently about, so I don't need to talk about that again. It's democracy. One is access to resources, which obviously Matt touched on, and that's about government grants, but also access from banks, which is what Matt talked about. And I think this is talking about communities as well as small businesses. It's not thinking like this, it's not like the social economy versus the private economy, it's both together. It's access to support for starting businesses or charities or any of those institutions that we need to help people kind of take more control locally. But the biggest one is, and it's the thing that I'm spending most of my time on at the moment, is access to land and buildings. So the decline in our social fabric that we talk about is like, it's like gaslighting as far as I'm concerned. I'm from Bradford, and I know that it's decades in the making. Those working men's clubs disappearing, libraries, social spaces, outdoor spaces, all that kind of thing. They've just gone and got there. And in the last 10 years, that's just been expedited. And if we don't bring more of that land and buildings back into community or public ownership, or in some sort of combination of the two, then it's like utterly pointless what we're doing. So we really, really need to push on that as a really strong foundation for everything else.
That's it. Thank you. Very concise and very much, I think, on the lines of what we've been talking about. The next person to say a little bit of introduction is Deanna Wildgoose from Colville. You've already had a name check, Deanna, as an example of what can be achieved by rolling your sleeves up and making, shaking the tree where you live. Can you just tell us a little bit about where you're at with that activity?
Thanks all. Yeah, very inspiring this morning. Honoured to be here. So yeah, we're in Colville, which is a little mining town in the centre of the country, typical of lots of other places that I've heard you all speak about. And we just decided last year that we just needed to roll our sleeves up and get going, dedicating at least the next 15 years to generating genuine community wealth by ownership of buildings and places. So we've been working together with local teams, but pulling in sort of experts from around the country, coming on things like this and looking at the buildings and spaces that are available in the community that aren't being used well, like markets, leisure centres that are about to shut, cooperative buildings that have been closed for years. And we've got big ambitions to take them over with complete community ownership. And what we're doing is developing tools and resources as we go to share with others. So things like community asset bingo, wicked spreadsheets. If you want to know about any of those and the fuller story, there is a workshop on Wednesday that I'll share in chat. But thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. You seem to be making progress. We've noticed over the last year, I think it's getting listened to is one of the first things, isn't it? And then
absolutely. We have the keys. We've got the keys to our first space at a charity that have given us the whole of the top floor, so we can look out over Colville and put flags in places as the community take ownership.
Oh, congratulations. The next person is Quiver O'Gorman. Now I'm in Hastings and Quiver's in Hastings. What we've had in Hastings is a number of old buildings and resources which have come on the market in various forms. And there's been a combination of people seeking to keep them in use for community and local benefit rather than just become yet other typical property developments. Quiver, can you just give us a little bit of a take on how all that's happening?
Yes, really inspiring speakers today. It's so great to see that whatever might be stopping us, people are still just getting on with it. It's really great to see. I work for Hastings, Heart of Hastings Community Land Trust, but everything that we do, I'm really glad to see your 9th principle stating that genuine and continual engagement with people, because that's what the most important thing is, that all of this is community led rather than, because that local people know what needs to be done. And the Land Trust works with a whole host of organisations and partners, and we are calling ourselves the Hastings Commons. And we are working currently in the White Rock area of Hastings with a few buildings that have specific challenges. One of them is the Observer building, and that has been derelict for 35 years. And as you said, you know, what has happened in the history of that building while it's been derelict? It has been bought by more than 10 different owners, and in that time nothing has been done, despite a real energy in the community and a desire to do something about that. Instead, developers have sat on the property waiting for land value uplift to do their job for them. But we were delighted, as the Hastings Commons White Rock Neighbourhood Ventures Heart of Hastings, to take ownership of the Observer building on Valentine's Day 2019. And now finally development is starting, and we are so excited to see that happening as a result of that continued engagement in the White Rock area.
Thank you. Maybe some questions will follow on those approaches you've used. Finally, Noel Lynch, he's had a name check already from Richard. An old chum of mine, Noel. I lived in East Finchley, read The Archer, went to find the people behind it, bumped into Noel. Noel knows everything about the place because he's a community activist with his own little business. A hub of knowledge and a drop-in centre and all that combined. Noel's replicated that 2 or 3 times. Noel, tell us your little business model of the green room and how you try to pull together some of the threads that we've been talking about this morning. Are you on? Where's he gone?
You're muted now.
Sorry, I forgot to turn it off. I turn it on. The Green Room is an official not-for-profit shop. It's a charity shop, and we sell mostly very unusual stuff. Bric-a-brac, but also antiques and curiosities and books and records and all sorts of stuff, totally packed. And the idea is that people would come in, we'd be able to talk to them. We have leaflets there from various organizations, mostly environmental organizations, but others as well, animal rights and local campaigns. And it's a form of low-key campaigning without people even knowing they're being campaigned to. And the whole idea was to show people we're not weird characters with tails and sandals and things like that. Beards, all right.
Yeah.
But
ask him if he's
and yeah, it's in North Finchley. Closed down at the on lockdown at the moment for 2 weeks now in North Finchley, Tally-Ho Corner, which some people think is an amusing place, but that is the name of the area. And that was the idea. Previous to that, when I was East Finchley, I had a similar shop, and we formed The Archer there. Now, The Archer is a tabloid. It's been going now for over 25 years, and it only circulates and it will only cover East Finchley. But East Finchley is a kind of like a little urban village. And it's, we founded The Archer. It's my big boast in life that I founded and finance a tabloid newspaper that's still going 20 odd years later, when lots of them went bankrupt in the meantime. And it cost me £15, but for the first edition. And yes, that, as I say, is still going, very popular, and that's the type of idea. Now, I'm very keen on newspapers because, you know, that you can get printed a 2-page, you can now do 4-page newspapers. Before 8 was the smallest. You can do 4-page now. You can do a 4-page newspaper for the price of a glossy A5 leaflet. And I think a newspaper is much more impressive. It's bigger, it's harder to take around through the doors and things, but it's, yes, so 4 of us founded The Archer, as I say, about 25 or 30 years ago, and it's still working. But We work on a similar thing on the green room, and people come in never knowing it's even a charity shop. People think it looks more like a old curiosity shop, which is the whole idea. But I was previously on the London Assembly, elected member of the London Assembly, and I was also head of standards for the Greater London Authority. But we lost my seat anyway. But I'm not as active as I used to be, and the shop is our latest campaign because the council now want to bulldoze the whole area and wipe out this lovely little Art Deco arcade, which is fully tenanted, even though the council says it's not, and we are fighting them back. I think
you're in the thick of it all the time. Whatever you're doing, ever since I've known you, whatever's the issues, you're in there. Now, what we're going to try and do now, and this is a little experiment, because we've got a large audience and a big panel. We've got Nick Waits to act as the monitor of what's being said on the chat discussion, to see any issues that are emerging, and if we can give those some airing on the panel. Can I get you on in this one, Nick, now?
Yeah, sure. Hello.
What are you picking up? Now, apart from your own views, which I would be interested in anyway because of your background in community activism and community planning, it's a question of putting a few issues on the table now that have emerged this morning. Can you help us?
Well, I sort of get the feeling from this morning that we've got a movement happening. And, you know, I'm finding it very exciting. I think everybody seems to be finding it exciting and inspiring that by looking at what's going on in various different parts of the country and the whole issue of democracy, which at an international level is clearly becoming so depressing, that actually there's some real excitement coming from local activity in this country. And I think it's, as I say, it's inspiring. I think it's very interesting that have been requests, a lot of requests for feedback about this event, people being able to hear it again, see it again, engage again. And I just think it would be really interesting to hear people's comments in the last few moments about how this thing is taken forward. I really think that Peter and Richard need to be congratulated for having got this all together. And it would be really good to hear from people how we can take it forward.
Thanks, that's a great idea. If we could pick up 2 or 3 or maybe more, but hopefully a manageable number of further initiatives, further ways of strengthening what you correctly describe as a movement. Richard and I'll be delighted to take that away and work on it. Can I just run through the whole panel? Heaven knows who's going to go first, but I think if you want to unmute yourself as a panelist and make a contribution, please do so. Everybody's still here. What is missing in terms of activity? And I don't mean on the ground, because we've got examples of great things happening all over the place. What is missing in terms of the synthesis of all this? Has anybody got a suggestion of where there's a gap to fill? Ruth, you're waving at me.
Yes. Am I on mute?
You're
No,
just
I'm not.
speaking fine.
There's quite a big move nationally to get funding for an infrastructure organisation to provide support to what they are calling the democracy sector. And I think the Joseph Rowntree Trust is hoping to fund such an organisation. I know there's a consortium of organisations who've gone forward and hopefully will be funded. I'm right on the fringes, but I see their stuff coming through and I like being in that network. So there's that's happening. And a recognition that together people are stronger. The other one that I've come across is an emerging movement. It's called the Movement for Neighbourhood Democracy, which is also worth a look. And that's my contribution for now.
Thank you. Matt Leach, while you're with us, you have a magic touch to get connected to the government resources. I don't know where you got your kitty, exactly how that was created, but is there any other stream of activity in hand that we could connect with?
Peter, I think Matt had to go.
Okay, I saw him there just now, but he's just gone literally.
But just to add that local trusts were funded by a big endowment from the National Lottery, as is Power to Change. So there are people who are working. I think if you look at the Left Behind Communities, APPG, that Matt linked to earlier, it will give a sense of the people who are trying to lobby national government around the kind of stuff that we're talking about.
Do you think that the APPG would be interested in our principles? Because I mean, we're going to try and disseminate them as widely as possible. And obviously you've got connections there and we haven't at the moment.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think that we should be, you should be putting them out to lots of different people. I'm sure there's lots of suggestions from people on the panel, but I'm happy to share.
Richard, maybe afterwards we can go around those who've attended today and ask them who they think we should be addressing these points to. Any contacts individuals have that we can mutually benefit from. Okay. Can I ask Matthew Brown? You've kindly stayed for this discussion as well as your presentation, Matthew. I mean, your networking seems to be going exceptionally well because you've got quoted in all sorts of places. I noticed The Economist was on the clips that you put on your first slide. What do you think the technique needs to be to, once you've got something going like you have, to make sure it spreads?
Yeah, I think the reason why we got so much interest is because of the ambition that we have in terms of the transformation of our local community and economy. So I think if the set of ideas you have are strong enough, they'll get noticed. Now, being in newspapers is okay, but it's obviously not as good as actually getting that change there on the ground, really. So I think you need to have a distinct set of policies and ideas around transformation in the community, and that appears to be there already. I've just seen the 9 principles, that looks pretty good. And then from that, you then need to engage with others within your community and beyond who can actually help you facilitate that. So, you know, the way we've done it in Preston is obviously we've worked with our big institutions, our local businesses, but also our faith sector as well, BCFS sector, trade unions, you know, and if you bring them together in a coalition, then you can actually make something happen. But in terms of things you want to do, I think you need to decide specifically what they're going to be. So it could be around community ownership of assets, it could be around procurement, it could be around finance, or it could be around ownership of the local economy. And just decide on 2 or 3 things, and then try and get that broad coalition of support, really. And it sometimes means as well, like Preston, you've got to approach bigger organisations than yourself who might have more power and influence and resource. But if you can win the battle of ideas, then they tend to join you. I mean, our NHS has just actually, about 18 months ago, joined our procurement journey, and it's joining the other community wealth building journey we're doing at the moment. So a local company was used to buy masks during the pandemic in Preston. So I think 30% of the hospital workers in Preston and central Lancashire were masks sourced by a local company. That created 90 jobs. So if you do that, you then create a coalition of organisations and ideas and policies around trying to achieve what you want to achieve. So I'd start with 2 or 3 things that you want to do, and then just try and reach out, really. Can
I just ask you, while we've got someone at a national level, influencing at a national level, you made a point, you're a Labour council, but you didn't make a big point about Labour this, Labour that, Labour the other. You're achieving results. How does that play with the current government, which isn't Labour? I mean, do you think that because it's working, because it's valuable, they can bring themselves to say, yeah, let's try and do more of it?
I've got mixed feelings, because I do not trust this government at all. I don't trust its motivations in any way, shape or form. So I'm sorry for being a bit political in that respect. But, you know, we've got to work with what we have. So we've got a towns fund, which we've been successful at. And obviously there is an element within the NHS long-term plan. They talk about the role of the NHS as an anchor institution, who they recruit, progression, what they do with their assets and where they purchase. So we'll work with what we've got already with the current government, even though there's a obviously a lot of mistrust as a Labour politician myself, but then crucially as well, creating new institutions like municipally owned cinemas, and like new public housing through the company potentially, and like a community bank, and like cooperatives. That is a way you put new democracy in your local economy, because, you know, there's been lots of discussion today around political democracy, which is good, but there's also economic democracy. And the reason why we got such inequality is because so many in our community, probably the majority in our country as well, have little say over what happens in the workplace and elsewhere, you know, and that must be tackled, to be honest. And that then gets to the question, you know, we're heading towards an American system, and it's got better with the election of Biden, in my opinion. But, you know, until recently, you had, you know, big corporations and billionaires who donated to both Democratic and Republican parties. And why they're doing that, they're not doing it because out of philanthropy, they obviously want something back from them, don't they? So there's a sense that you can't really have a true democracy. You've got so much wealth in the hands of so few people. And again, during the pandemic, I think the world's billionaires' wealth has increased by 26%. And there's real questions about having a real democracy in your community. We've got that inequality, sadly. And the way to fight back is obviously you need to have a government that will tackle that. But in the meantime, you can do a lot locally and regionally, as we've seen in areas like Mondragon in Spain, where they've actually, through the Catholic Church, actually, they had this network of 120 worker-owned businesses, which they formed. So it's good.
The two things that struck me this morning most, I think, are your chart of the genuine firepower that you can identify financially in an area, and Ruth's chart of the lack of fairness in the democratic structure that can exist. Those two charts, which you wouldn't normally produce, they're not part of anybody's remit. No council's been asked to say, are we being democratic? And no council's been asked, are we using our resources well? But you've done it, and Ruth's done it, to show just where there are problems. If I would love to think of Sheffield adopting the Preston model after the election.
I can tell you there are many people in Sheffield who talk to us, thousands around the streets, who talked about Preston. Yeah. And about a democracy moving beyond this sense of basic representation and participation into this democratization of an economy. Yeah. And we are all envious of you, Matthew, here in Sheffield.
Well, there's going to be some transfer. There must be, it's sensible. Going back to you, Viv, in Bexhill. Now, I mean, I'm not going to preempt the result, but you will have a new agency in the town when the council starts going. It is a parish council. It's not a district council or a city. But I mean, what economic activities you might be able to do to change things in Bexhill? Are you not thinking of one or two initiatives on these lines?
We will be, but at the moment we're concentrating on making it clear that we're not prescribing what we think Bexhill needs. For so long, people haven't really been invited to be involved, and so we're focusing on participation, getting to know what Bexhill has, what it doesn't have, what people want, what they need. So we haven't come up with a manifesto as such. There are all sorts of possibilities because we're a coastal town. We're on one hand quite rich, on the other hand quite poor, different neighbourhoods, with very few big employers, like one big employer. And Rother District Council is also making enormous strides in that area. So we hope to work together with the district. But yeah, we've tried to, whilst pointing out what other places do, we've been careful not to say this is what we think Bexhill should have. But the first year, I think, will be a slow process of getting everything in working order and involving people and finding out what we should be focusing on.
Well, a bit of listening,
but I think it should be interesting.
A bit of listening will probably shock people. So it's probably a good tactic to say, look, we'd like to hear from you what we should be doing, not we're going to tell you what we think we should be doing. Which brings me, I think...
It's so good to actually have a meeting as well.
Which brings me to
meetings.
Sorry, yeah, just involving people. I think we're coming towards the end, but I think Peter McFadden, you really could contribute something important at this point in terms of you having probably ploughed this furrow longer than anybody else in our discussion today. I hope I haven't done anybody an injustice. I expect I have, Noel. But Peter, how are you reading this in terms of a trajectory going forward now?
I think the most interesting points are the edges, Peter, in a sense, as they are in any good ecology. It's a sort of, I sent a note to Matthew Brown about, you know, partly being hugely enthusiastic about what they've done in Preston. Because when it first turned out, you know, the Preston model suddenly appeared and I read about it, my fear was, that's it. You know, they'll now rest on their laurels, and they definitely haven't done that. And what's so brilliant is how that's expanded into other things. But it sounds like that's mainly because they, or not mainly, but perhaps crucially within that, is they've really recognized that you can't do it to the people, that there has to be that genuine engagement with people who then are taking ownership. So they can only push it out and really expand it, a lot of those ideas, by having people genuinely involved. And that seems to me the bit that's often missing, that some of these ideas, you know, that there are people like what Ruth's doing is a struggle because the council are totally against it, or have been. But if we can find councils and you know, if they can just start to recognise it's in their own interests, and it sounds like what's really happened in Preston is that the council has gone, it's not a matter of retaining power, is it, by the council? They've kind of gone, we can only genuinely do this, you know, if we have the people. And there's so much to do that the idea of traditional politics of hanging on to power has got to end. I mean, for me, the more places that there are like Bexhill that actually win elections and then do stuff, you know, they will be examples, as Frome, as Buckfastleigh, as Haswell's community. You know, there are a growing number of places, and Preston obviously, that have really shown what can be done. If we get another, you know, whatever, 2030 in May, that'll then help. And that's getting proper examples out there will be what's going to be really key.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to answer either one of the questions I've made or another one that I haven't? David G, you're the other half of Democracy for Bexhill, in case anybody doesn't realise why you're here. David, what would you like to add?
Well, not so much the other half of Democracy for Bexhill. My wife does that. I was just the instigator of the big conference, which you've now really nicely turned into a virtual one, which, although much smaller, has been, I think, very good. I'd like to say a couple of words at the end to say thank you. But on this point, I just want to inspire people with other examples that are small. Preston's quite big, Sheffield's quite big. Bolney Village, 500 people, not far from here, did a deal with a developer, a good deal, and got 12 affordable homes for that village in perpetuity, plus a rental income stream. They also got lots of improvements to the public realm by you know, other institutions realizing that it's worth investing in even a small village. Secondly, nearby, Cuckmere Community Solar Farm is another really interesting small scale but very dynamic development from into renewable energies. And the third one is the New Economics Foundation's work on Back to the Sea campaign, which is a national campaign, but it's focused on coastal towns and how they can be revived. And we can learn a lot from them. They were going to be on the big conference agenda. And I hope in November or somewhere in the autumn, we'll run the big conference and they'll be back to help us with that campaign. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, these smaller little fine-grained innovations. Dina, that's your speciality, isn't it? In Colville, I mean, just out of interest, and I don't know the answer to this, you don't actually engage at the council level locally, do you? You're not a council member, or have you got a town council? What's your relationship with the powers that be in
Interesting question. So we're working on lots of different levels. So I would say we're building relationships with councillors of all types. We're also, I've put it in chat, one of our young people that we've just employed on the Kickstart scheme. He started off talking very negatively about where he lived. In 2 weeks, he's now converted into setting up Thrinxton Parish Council and helping one of the councillors set up Colville Town Council, because it actually hasn't got one, it's just got a special expenses committee. And he's talking about representing the area, and that was just in 2 weeks of bringing him into the fold, connecting him with others, sharing the stories, getting him to understand what communities are about and how he can actually have an impact.
marvellous, really.
Yeah.
And you've got that paid for under a government scheme, Kickstart.
So the Kickstart, absolutely, the Kickstart
So-
scheme has just been an incredible opportunity for a group like us, which hasn't got any, you know, regular funding
Well,
coming in.
the idea of Kickstart Town Council is a fantastic link up, isn't it? So look, I think we will need to bring things to a conclusion. We've gone past 1 o'clock and you've given up your Sunday mornings. So before we finish, I will ask David and Viv to say farewell and whatever they want to say from Bexhill, where we've virtually been today. And I shall go back to Richard to ask Richard to say a wind up, a few words, and perhaps indicate steps forward that we might be taking. So David or Viv, would you like to do a...
Well, I'll just say a brief farewell, and we'll keep you all posted. And thank you so much for your support, which, as you know, makes a huge difference. All the people, I'm just one of so many people here who've been trying to make change, and hopefully, whatever happens, we'll still be here beavering away. Now, Dave's holding up my document. Okay, so thank you and goodbye. And you're all welcome to come along and.
We're desperately keen to come and see you in the flesh.
Absolutely.
Okay. I just need 45 seconds, Peter, if you've got that.
Yeah.
Okay, so to say thank you to you and Richard for picking up the baton of this, what was a huge conference in the Delaware Pavilion, people-wise, into this virtual one, which has been very, very useful. And you've introduced new sources of speakers that have been truly inspirational. So thank you for that. Particularly thank you to speakers who hung on for the last 18 months with this date in their diary, like Malcolm, busy Malcolm from Preston. And just add Wigan, will you, Malcolm, to your local bank, because that's nearby, it's my hometown. And the final thing is, I need help with 3 ideas here locally. One is the Bexhill Community Energy Company, which I think we should set up. Number 2, we should create not only a Bexhill Fair Trade Town, which it is, but add to it Bexhill Fair Rent Town and Bexhill Fair Employment Town. Low cost, hopefully useful things to do. And finally, I have 5,000 of these leaflets for Viv's campaign to deliver in the next 3 weeks. So if anybody local wants to help, please get in touch, because I can't do them all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, but I better say other candidates are available. I think, but I could secretly say, but maybe I've got my favourites. Right, now Richard, back to you. Just wrap us up.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, look, thank you to everybody for what's been we knew it was going to be a busy 2 hours. This is like the least we've ever overrun in one of our forums by 10 minutes, but thanks ever so much for everybody turning out on a Sunday. Civic Revival was really going to be about face-to-face, meeting people in places, and we've had to be online, but we've discovered a lot of plus points from that. And I just want to say to everybody who's still on the call that Civic Revival website, which we've worked quite hard on, exists and is available as a platform for what you want to put up and what you want to say. So if David, for example, wants to write us a short article on what he's planning for Bexhill and where you can get support, write that article, send it to us, and we'll post it, and we will help you reach out to people who might have the answers you're looking for. So we're able to, and that's an offer that's open to everybody on the call. Contact me, myself, or Tom Daldry at Civic Revival, and we'll go on civic-revival.org.uk, get in touch with us, and we'll make the website as lively as it can be. And when the lockdown's over and we can meet again, we will try to arrange face-to-face events so that people can meet people. I've already promised Dina we're going to turn up in Colville before the year is out, and we can turn up with 70 people. That'll be all right with you, Dina, I hope. You can put sandwiches on for us all. So that's it from me. What we do now, nothing that's been contributed in the margin in the chat will be lost. We take a while, but we eventually get there. We write up the events, we post the full video on the Civic Revival website, and we'll email everybody to let you know when that's done. And in the meantime, we're going to do our program of sharing out the 9 principles for civic leadership. And if anybody who wants to get involved in that process, feel free to share it widely and to use it in your own community. And let us know how you got on, most importantly. So that's it from me. Thank you for bearing with us, and back to you, Peter.
And that's it from me.